So welcome back once again to Third Age Reforged and to the penultimate faction showcase, and today we will be looking at the final elven faction, and that is Lothlorien. And to start off with, I suppose a good starting point to think of would be the elven faction they share most in common with would probably be Imladris. However, they do have their focuses in certain other areas. They focus a little bit more around attack and damage in melee than the more defensive nature of Imladris, the more conservative nature. And to my mind that does make them a little bit more difficult to play, because obviously that is more risky if your units are a little bit more fragile. And Imladris, of course, they offer a little bit more of a backstop with their higher armor values overall, armor values comparable or even greater than, in several cases, some of the human and even dwarven factions. But Lothlorien, they do have better armor values than at least Mirkwood and Linden, with those factions it's a definite weakness of theirs. But Lothlorien have got decent enough, and obviously combining that with their high melee skill that all the elven factions have, that stands them in pretty good stead. They also have a smaller roster, as most elven factions tend to have, but obviously there's a lot of quality packed into these fewer units. So let's get right on with it. And interestingly enough, actually, starting off with the artillery, start off with the catapult. This is just a standard catapult and a standard ballista as we move over here. I think my mouse is dying, which is unfortunate. But yeah, both are just standard rather than the high elven versions, because of course they are Sylvan elves, as they were known in vanilla. But yeah, obviously siege, it applies here as well. I think in an open field you're less likely to see siege equipment because it is more difficult to defend it with the lower amount of elven numbers that you will have available. Really it's only Linden that can deploy numbers deploy a big enough army generally to defend siege and make it worth it in certain situations, but obviously you'll still see them in siege battles quite a lot, or very unorthodox pitch battle armies. But starting off with, elves don't really have militia tier units, but here we have a very unique unit indeed in the Sylvan Staff Masters. They are, well, they can do Skilltron, they can hide anywhere, so you can use them as an ambush unit, although the usefulness of this is probably more down to their very low armor value, so it's mainly to keep them out of arrow fire from the early game rather than engaging in crippling ambushes. They have a bonus fighting cavalry, which is interesting. I suppose this means they technically count as two-handed spears and effective against armor. They also have an armor upgrade, which makes them substantially better looking. They look almost like assassins here, and obviously that will increase the armor value essentially by 2, but this is still a low armor value. It says they have a shield value as well, which is quite interesting. But primarily the Sylvan Staff Masters, interestingly enough in terms of their function, probably have most in common with the Barrow Wights from Gundabad, and this is that they are a pure melee tar pit. You won't get too many kills with these, even with the effectiveness against armor and bonus fighting cavalry. It's a very low base attack and there aren't very many of them. But the fact that you can put them into Skilltron, you can use them as a rearguard action or just saturate your line with them. And they're very difficult to break down because of their total defense. They have a defensive skill which is usually reserved for dual wielding units only, and very select, sort of very high tier two-handed swordsmen. But yeah, only 575 as well. This is the cheapest unit in the Lothlorien roster, and they can potentially hold up units for a long time. They're quite like pikes in that way, although don't expect them to last quite so long as pikes if sufficient pressure is applied. Now the unit which most people will put a lot of these into their army when you play as Lothlorien is the Sylvan Spears. They are the basic spears that you can bring as Lothlorien. They do not have the sort of basic entry-level infantry unit that the other elven factions have, so the Eldar Makar, the Harlinden infantry, or the... it's not the Hethley Tower, is it? The bloody Mirkwood names, I swear. Megil e Erin, I think that was their name. But they don't have them. The Sylvan Spears are much more comparable to the Thrandrim e Erin, and you can still make a pretty decent front line with Elven Spears because they do have nice defensive skill and better attack than most units from the Kingdoms of Men will have, but do remember they have that spear malus at fighting infantry. But of course, bonus fighting cavalry can make shield wall, going to be an important crutch of your defence in a siege battle, or potentially the first line in an offensive siege battle. Decent stats all around, and you're likely to see quite a lot of them because they are the easiest unit to mass up based on their lower cost. However, now we move into the middle bracket that I've set up here for Lothlorien, and this is where the vast bulk of their units are, and they have quite a lot to choose from here with regards to their sort of middle tier, although for most other factions this would be pushing into high tier, of course, non-elven factions. Starting with the Sindar Blade Masters. Once upon a time these guys were the rivals for the Haven Guard, for the best two-handed swordsman in the game. Those times are gone, but they are still a very effective unit, and they are a good ambush unit. Of course, they can hide anywhere, which of course means in the late game, if you bring these guys out when your opponent is already flagging, they're going to not enjoy that too much. They've got very high defensive skill, of course, comparable to the Sylvan Staff Masters, only they also back this up with a high attack score of 16, good charge bonus as well, and they also have the armor upgrade, which is actually previously, this was the standard unit model, and this is just the more lightly armored version. But of course this means their armor is just that little bit more solid, and essentially it means that they're just that little bit more effective. Obviously against arrow fire it's not going to make too much of a difference. This is still one of the units which isn't going to do too well under arrow fire, but this is also where the hiding comes into play. Very, very good unit, and honestly 725 is a decent price for a unit of this type. However, the first of the 2 line infantry units that Lothlorien can have that aren't spearmen are the Lothlorien axes, and this is the one which is a little bit more attack focused, and this is something which differentiates them a little bit from Imladris. Obviously they have that pretty high armor value of 8, which again puts them into direct comparison with Imladris, and they have that total defense of 28 as a result. That's very high for a unit which could potentially bring quite a few of these and put them all along your front line. An attack of 14 as well is very high for a unit which uses a shield. Shield value of 8 and an armor value of 8 means arrows are going to struggle to find purchase on them unless they're of sufficiently high quality. But they are pretty expensive at 775, and there aren't too many of them, which, you know, this is obviously a weakness of the elves in general, but you do need to set your lines up correctly, otherwise they will be overwhelmed. But provided you can keep the enemy in front of you, the Lothlorien axes will do very, very well indeed, chopping their way through units of a similar type with relative ease most of the time. Then another unit, which interestingly enough Lothlorien kind of have a little bit of a monopoly on when it comes to the elves, is a 2-handed axe unit, and obviously this means you have an AP unit, an AP shock unit, where a lot of the other elves are reliant on their pure skill to try and get their way through a fight like that. And this is a big deal for them. The Lothlorien warriors, despite the fact they cost 800, have no shield, and there are only 103 of them, often make up a quite important part of the Lothlorien army, because if you can keep them out of the archers' range and then use them in the late game against more heavily armoured factions like Gondor or the Dwarves, they can of course do very, very well for you and potentially win you the battle if you use them correctly. Attack of 16 again is very high. Their defensive skill is also very high for an axe unit like this as well, where we'd be used to seeing numbers like 3 and 4. Here we have 12, and of course they still have decent armour of their own, so non-AP units will have to get through that armour value of 8, which, you know, it's a very, very good unit, and honestly it's one of the real selling points for Lothlorien's infantry and one of the reasons why you would pick them over Imladris. However, we also have a spear unit, a little bit more defensive here, the Lothlorien spears. They aren't as good as the Eldarenwe spearmen, it must be said, but the Eldarenwe are significantly more expensive. The Eldarenwe Haru Hatal. Again, it's a nightmare to remember all these elven names. At least Lothlorien have still got relatively simplistic names for my tiny brain. But an attack of 9, again, that's high for a spear unit, even one that costs 800. And again, the total defense is 28, so they have identical defensive stats to the axes. Only, of course, they add a shield wall and a bonus fighting cavalry to this, so they can be used out on the flank. Or, of course, in a siege, they can be used to mount up a very difficult to break down front line indeed. And then we also have the Lothlorien Swordmasters. All the elven factions have got these more heavy swordsmen, and based on, well, I'm pretty sure that the stats have changed since then, but based on the very crude tests, admittedly, that I ran a few months ago, the Lothlorien Swordmasters were actually the best of these elven swordsmen, individually speaking. 825 is round about the ballpark that you would expect to spend on a unit like this. I think Linden's are slightly cheaper. I think maybe Imladris is slightly more expensive because they also add a bonus versus cavalry into the mix. But very good stats all around. Obviously high defensive skill and high armour means it's going to be very difficult to kill them individually. Most players will resort to overwhelming elven armies, and this is a unit which you will often have to engage in such things against, and their attack of 16 ensures that they're going to be carving their way through your manpower all the while that you do that. And then finally, the other line infantry unit that they have is the most expensive unit on this tier, the Lothlorien Blades at 850. They do have a lower attack, but they also meet this with a higher defense, so they will last longer in a more grindy fight. This is going to be the unit that maybe you want, comparable to the Imladris units of a similar type, honestly, with a total defense of 31. The Imladris Guardians would be a very good unit to compare them to. Difference being that you can't upgrade the armour of the Lothlorien Blades, but they already sit at 8 anyway, so that's a pretty good number for elves. And then obviously a massive defensive skill of 15 for a unit with a shield. Shield value of 8, of course. Very, very solid unit. Again, the numbers and the cost are the things that you have to watch out for as the elves, but provided you can get favourable engagements, the elves are going to slaughter their foes all day long, and Lothlorien are a very good example of this. Now, the only unit that really counts as a sort of general's bodyguard tier unit that they have in their infantry corps anyway is going to be the Karas Kaladhon's Guardians, and they are a pike unit that inspire nearby troops. Of course, they can form phalanx like any pike unit can, bonus fighting cavalry, frightened nearby enemy infantry. These stats are very, very good for pikemen. They cost 1400. I mean, honestly, these stats are the sort of thing you expect to see on standard infantrymen from other factions. An attack of 17 as well on pikes is madness. Obviously, they look fantastic, but obviously the most significant thing is the fact that they have 2 HP, and this means that it's going to be nigh on impossible to wear them down from the front, at least in a cost-effective manner. I'm sure that you could if you were in a siege and you just had this unit left alive and you decided to send your legions of orcs forward to try and slowly but surely bring them down, but I think there's little doubt really that this is, individually speaking, the best pike unit in the game. They've got fantastic stats, multiple HP, but they are very expensive obviously, and for this reason you're probably less likely to see them on a field battle, because there are other units that that Lothlorien can bring that would maybe better fit an open field, but in a siege they'd be very, very tempting to bring, and even in a field battle you could try and get a little bit more creative with them perhaps, but maybe in team-based games it would be interesting to see how they could work, but obviously very, very frightening in terms of their stats. But now we shall move on to the archers and the cavalry, which they don't have too much of an extensive list of, but what is there is very significant. So as we can see, we're going to be getting through this faction a little bit quicker than the likes of Umbar, simply because there are less units, but obviously all elves are going to have some level of strength within their archers. Even in Imladris, who focus most of their attention elsewhere, have got a very solid selection of archers, and Lothlorien are no different, despite having some very nice focuses around melee damage. And we shall start off with the Etheltirith, which are, in effect, if you look at similar units, you'd be looking at the Eldar Winger, or something similar to that. Again, I'm trying to remember the 4 Linden Archers, that's it, from Linden. Obviously, very low armour score, very limited in terms of their shield. Having said that, you can upgrade the armour of them, although I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, it doesn't really make any difference at all when it comes to their look, but of course it will make them a little bit tougher, but for the most part you'll probably be spending your upgrades elsewhere, because you're never really going to be able to bulk these guys up enough to make them all that good in a skirmish fight. Obviously quite fragile, but in terms of the level of quality that they get downrange, they have a missile attack of 6, just like all entry-level elven archers do, but of course in a skirmish fight they will be outnumbered, and generally speaking they'll fall by the wayside pretty quickly. But honestly, 575 is not that much. I mean, that's not much more than the Riddermark archers, who've got worse stats all across the board. Missile attack of 4, only 123 however, and that is the primary weakness of all elven archers, is that there isn't enough of them really to go toe-to-toe in a skirmish fight with them. And obviously for any of you who have played the previous versions of the game, you'll be well acquainted with the horrors of the old way the elves used to win their skirmish battles. It was like the Battle of the Somme in World War I, but that isn't the case anymore. The elves need to be a little bit more savvy with how they use their archers. But of course the Etheltirith probably going to be brought most of the time because they are cheap, and of course they do still offer a good amount of damage and accuracy for the price. Then, however, we get into some of the... This is a very important tool for Lothlorien for the most part, and that is the Maethir Ilasgelen, a unit that they share with Mirkwood, and they do have identical stats and cost. I believe the identical cost anyway. It might be a little bit cheaper here. But of course they are the Javelin Spear hybrid. Very good missile attack in terms of 9 with that AP. Bonus fighting cavalry. They are a very good tool for zoning out enemy cavalry, and as Lothlorien you may need to do that. You do have a good selection of spears that you can use for this also, but your resources are going to be stretched quite thin in a field battle if you set up poorly. So they're a pretty good backstop honestly, and even if you just save them for the late game and then bring them out of their position to fire into the backs of the enemy infantry, that is an option, but for the most part they will be used as an anti-cavalry tool, I think, because obviously they are spears as well, so they do have that malice in melee, lower armor values, but still a very important part in the same way that they are for Mirkwood in many ways. And then, just like all elven factions as well, they have a slightly heavier, well, I guess Linden's Harland and archers are a little bit Harland and Guard I should say are a little bit different. The Lothlorien archers obviously bear quite a lot in common with the Hiri Peng from Mirkwood. Obviously they can use sharpened stakes, but these stats are very good across the board, and that is because they make for pretty good infantry in melee as well, honestly. They're sort of like the baby brothers to the Lothlorien swordmasters in melee. They won't be quite as good, but of course they do add that missile attack to them as well. Missile attack of 8 as well. I mean, very few units outside of the elves can get to a missile attack of 8 on their composite bow units. Very effective, but of course still, there are only 103 of them, so in a skirmish fight you'll need to get more archers than just the Lothlorien ones if you want to engage in a skirmish fight. Saturate the line with some Etheltirith and Lothlorien archers and you might be in business, but you'll obviously sacrifice some numbers in melee where you already would have had a numbers discrepancy anyway. And then, unlike Imladris, they do have access to a ranger, the Sylvan Rangers, previously known as the Sentinels of the Woodland Realm. And of course they bear most in common with the Mirkwood Rangers, which were the Delupeng, Em and Dwyer, and the Nimrodel Rangers from Dol Amroth, because they have a missile attack of 6 with that body piercing, of course. Good defensive skill as well, so once they get into melee they'll be difficult to break down, even if they won't get too many kills. Yeah, obviously Rangers again, I've said this time and time again, but it's very difficult to sort of say something new about Rangers most of the time. Some of them have got unique traits, like for instance the Sylvan Rangers with the slightly higher attack, but even so they're still going to fulfill the same purpose. Potentially Rangers are the group of units which are going to be able to get the highest kills in siege battles, of course, simply because of their nature. And then a choice of 2 General's Bodyguard units from Lothlorien, first of which being the Sindar Archers, the slightly cheaper version at 1300. Obviously they act as very good infantry in melee as well, because they've got high skill, high armour, very high melee attack honestly at 20 with a missile attack of 8 as well, total defense of 30, very good hybrid, and you can also upgrade the armour to make them shinier, I suppose, and that will make them even tougher. Of course there aren't many of them at 53, this is one of the smaller units in the game, outside of, well, even with Cavalry I suppose this still isn't really one of the most numerous units, but yeah, obviously very good sort of archer, swordsman hybrid. And for the most part though, I have seen these guys brought a little bit more, the golden Galathrib nobles, and just sort of, I'm interested to see actually what the primary differences between them are. And I think it comes down to, I suppose the Sindar Archers are a little bit better in melee in terms of their defense and damage, but the Galathrib nobles, there are more of them, and this essentially means that they're going to be better at range, because they're going to be able to get more missiles down range. There might be some differences in ammo as well, which we can look at on the army selection screen. A little bit more expensive as well, but that little bit more manpower does often make them worth it, and I have noticed the Galathrib nobles much more common than the Sindar Archers, but a lot of players tend to bring both as well, which is a little bit greedy perhaps, but they are individually very powerful units, and to be honest, outside of the pikes fighting head on, they are the strongest infantry that Lothlorien can bring as well overall. And then we come to Lothlorien's simply massive selection of cavalry. They have 2 units, although they can bring 3 of these before the cost increases, the Lothlorien Mounted Company. And the reason for that is you kind of, potentially you will need to, against certain factions and certain builds, have at least a lot of units that can move quickly and potentially engage as well. Now they are lancers of course, which does mean they have that armour piercing charge of 15, but their high defensive skill and their good armour values also mean that they are pretty difficult to break down, so they can actually, it's not cost effective to, but you can throw them into melee and they will beat units of a similar type, and at least make lower tier melee cavalry know that they've been in a fight. They do cost 1,000 though, so you definitely don't want to be throwing the Lothlorien Mounted Company into mercenary cavalry, as we have seen in the past from several replays. But they are still a very, very strong lancer, and do bear in mind that Lothlorien can bring them in numbers, because if you're unprepared for that, they could run you over. And then, throwing their hat into the ring for potentially the best horse archer in the game, we have the Galathrib Riders, which are essentially the Galathrib nobles on horseback, missile attack of 8. Good stats all around, honestly. To be honest with you, you won't want to engage them with just anything, because they've got very high skill, good armour as well, so they're going to be difficult to bring down. And their melee attack of 17 as well means they're honestly going to send basic units of melee and spear cavalry packing with stats like that, as long as they're backed up of course, because there are only 33 of them, not many at all, but they are still a unit of very, very high quality. So that is it. Lothlorien don't have the biggest roster, so I've tried to sort of pad what I was talking about just a little bit. But yeah, we'll go back to the army selection screen and I'll talk about what I think of Lothlorien. So, just as I was saying, I'm just going to check the ammo between these two. So, ammo of 18 on the Sindar Archers and an ammo of 14 on the Galathrib Nobles. So the Sindar Archers might actually be the most balanced choice, potentially. Although the Galathrib Nobles might be safer, simply because having more men in the unit often is a really big selling point, especially for the elves, who generally speaking are lacking in that department. So, yeah, it's interesting, but obviously the elves also have very high morale. The morale of the Sylvan Staff Masters is also locked. I forgot to mention that. They will essentially stand and fight until death for the most part, but also Lothlorien's morale in general is very high. 18 I think is actually the lowest you'll see. Actually 15 on the Ethel Tirith, and the Catapults I suppose have got, Siege in general has got lower morale. Very high morale faction indeed. But despite this, Lothlorien aren't really my cup of tea, because they are difficult to play, honestly. They are an elven faction which, quite similar to Mirkwood, and unlike Linden, it is easy to build an army wrong and go into the battle with the wrong mindset. As the elves, you can't really fight, especially as Lothlorien and Mirkwood in my opinion, you can't really fight in the same way that you would with a kingdom of men, for example, where you can put up just a front line, try and wear down the enemy through some lower tier archers, probe around the flanks with your more expendable cavalry, maybe with a couple of units of genuine quality there. With the elves, you need to be a little bit more savvy. I think you definitely need to stretch the battlefield as Lothlorien, because you are very vulnerable to being enveloped and surrounded, and as soon as you start to lose the advantage of your stats, as soon as you allow the enemy to get around you, a lot of Lothlorien's really genuinely good units start to lose their effectiveness, and that's a real shame because they do have some very strong units indeed. So I definitely think you need to stretch the battlefield. You do have options, but one of the reasons why they won't be for everyone is their cavalry, because the Lothlorien Mounted Company, it is difficult honestly to make them cost effective simply because the enemy is going to want to shut them down with their own melee cavalry. And a unit that costs 1,000 you don't really want to be throwing under the bus too often. And the Galatharim Riders, it's a similar story here. They're a very good horse archer and they are very sturdy, but there are only 33 of them and they cost 1,200. Having said that, in the right hands, similar to what I said about Rohan last time, in the right hands Lothlorien can be horrible to play against, because if you allow yourself to get your units 1-to-1 with Lothloriens, 9 times out of 10 they're going to lose. For example, if you put a unit of standard line infantry up against, from like one of the kingdoms of men, up against the Lothlorien axes without trying to surround them, you're going to get butchered. The Lothlorien axes will take that fight all day long. Huge attack values, very good defense values and defensive skill. You also have some limited options for ambushes with rangers and the Sindar Blade Masters and the Staff Masters. They are difficult, and if you're willing to invest a bit of time to master their playstyle, then you can have a lot of success with Lothlorien. But do bear in mind that of the elves, they and Mirkwood are slightly more difficult to play, in my opinion, than Imladris, who are able to be a little bit more defensive, have got more tanky units that won't go down so easily, and Linden, who offer more numbers and have got a lot of good compositions that they can bring, whereas it's much more easy with this roster here to bring bad armies. But again, I'm sure that J-Monster can go into more detail about this at some stage with regards to, you know, his army building videos, and Lothlorien are certainly a faction which I'd be interested to see some good armies built with Lothlorien. I've seen some effective armies used in the past, but obviously that classic elven, the classic thing which lets the elves down is their cost and their numbers, and you can circumvent this if you know how to play them, but it's still a difficult challenge to overcome, and for Lothlorien especially, I feel, because they've got a lot of expensive tools and they can't afford to bring them all. So yeah, that is it for Lothlorien. I'm not exactly sure how the scheduling is going to work, because this week is likely to be a little bit unpredictable. But obviously we've only got one showcase left, and that will be Arthedain, and then we'll be done with all the showcases, at least until the hypothetical point when more factions are added. But after that, I think we will be going back into, if people want them, some top 10s, but I'm willing to hear some feedback as well. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this, found it somewhat informative, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.